we're now going to take a look at what the umwelt is for a wolf and see how it's constructed bit by bit. So although I go through the same environment that they go through, I literally see it differently than they do. So how do they do that? Hi, welcome back to the Science of Wolves. Last month we looked at the concept of umwelts, and this time around we'll put that information to use and take a close look at the umwelt of wolves. If you haven't seen last month's video, I encourage you to do so before watching this one. But here's a brief review to keep us on track. An umwelt is our collective view, perception, and interpretation of the surrounding world. In other words, it's our personal world, validated by how we perceive things and the emotions and thoughts that go with it. And umwelts are based on a lot of things, but mostly on your anatomy, physiology, mood, past experience, and anything that helps create your experience of life. However, it is limited by what your body can sense around it and internally. For example, no living creature can experience all the available information that exists in the world. Instead, they're limited by what their senses have the ability to perceive. Then they live their lives as though all other information doesn't exist. For example, the ability to hear, see, smell, and so on, they all have limits. Our dogs, for example, can hear well beyond what we can, and same for their ability to smell. Of all the wavelengths of energy in the environment, we can only see the visible spectrum, which of course is why it's called the visible spectrum. And the result is that living organisms live their lives based on making decisions using limited information, which is why you live in a bubble of sorts. The entire point here is to try and view the world from a wolf's perspective. And this requires looking at bits and pieces of what science knows about how that world is constructed. This process is made easier by the fact that, for example, wolves and other mammals share more similarities than differences. Intellect is one of those things. For example, rats have as good decision-making abilities as humans do, believe it or not. And science also knows that animals plan for the future, just like we do. There's also our body design. And the fact that we all have DNA means we're all related somehow. And when it comes to us mammals, we're all related because of the way we're designed. In many ways, a mammal is a mammal is a mammal. And that's because nature doesn't reinvent the wheel for each and every mammalian species. Instead, we're all designed the same way, but certain aspects are modified according to how that species lives in the world. For example, the mammalian brain is organized in the same way for each species, although this basic design is then modified to fit the lifestyle of that species. Regardless of the lifestyle, vision, for example, is always in the back, and movement is initiated in the frontal lobe of the brain. It turns out that moving around is very complicated, so many brain areas are involved to just getting across the room safely. And one of those areas is the cerebellum, which all mammals have, and is involved in the coordination of movement. Other similarities include our emotions. And that's another way that we're all linked together. So it's not just body design and DNA and so on, it's what the brain can produce, in this case emotions, which shouldn't be a surprise to any pet owner. Animals obviously have emotions. And they have emotions that are very, very similar to ours, if not the same. And because animals have emotions, they can also suffer from emotional disorders. And we'll take a look at this study more closely in a future video. Also, hunting by humans can produce higher emotional stress on wolves than they would normally experience. And the social structure of wolf packs who are being hunted can also be disrupted by the constant pressure of hunting. Given all of these similarities, it is a bit easier to figure out how animals perceive and respond to their surroundings, because we don't always have to start from scratch. Instead, for example, we know that most animal species have eyes like us, and the same basic design is modified according to how they live and fit into the environment. When it comes to wolves, they have retinas that are very similar to ours, but they still function a bit differently, especially when it comes to the perception of movement. That means their interpretation of the world will be different than ours. And last month I showed you a video of Shoni, my dog, racing around the snow, and slowed down the video to show you what was really happening when she was running at such speeds. So let's take a look at that again. She's going too fast in real time to see, at least for me, for my eyes, and see what she's actually doing. So I slowed it down, and I'm going to do it again here to show you what she's really doing when she passes by. And she's looking right into my eyes, right into my face. As a communication device, so to speak, which is what dogs do. Wolves do the same thing. I assume she's expecting me to be looking back and seeing what she's doing, but of course my perceptual abilities are not capable of doing that. And as she passes by, she goes into the snowbank, and just before she makes that right turn, you could see her arms sticking out, and her hips are already kind of headed to the right. So if you could see that kind of detail at those speeds, especially if you're a wolf and any other predator, chasing down your prey would be a bit easier because you can anticipate the prey's move before they actually make it, not afterwards. Because if you're just going to follow them around, always responding to everything they do, exactly without anticipation, then you'll never catch up. So it turns out dogs and wolves can do this because they perceive motion quite differently than we do. Plus, the science shows that dogs are more attuned to the actions of an object rather than what the object is, at least initially. They need to sense immediately in their surrounding environment what may or may not be creeping up towards them, and then react to it appropriately. In other words, be more sensitive to the movement first, then figure out what the object is. Of course, this kind of mental processing happens quickly, and it's just that reacting to motion first is the higher priority. In fact, dogs are built for this, and the design of their retinas help point this out. And you'll see, excuse the pun, how amazingly different wolves and dogs can experience the same thing that you do under the same circumstances. In other words, their umwelt is quite different than ours, even though we all experience the same event at the same time. This process is fascinating because science can actually figure this stuff out. Therefore, we'll have to review some science for a few minutes and go over how the retina perceives motion and how it's interpreted by the brain. But remember, these videos are called The Science of Wolves, but the term science can make some people feel intimidated. Even my students in the past, when they were purposely taking a science course, still felt intimidated by the process of science. So at the beginning of the course, it sometimes felt like they resisted a bit until they got used to the process of learning scientific concepts. So there was often some moaning and groaning until we got into the routine for the course. But science is just an extension of everyday common sense. But Uncle Jay is here to help you and guide you through it all. Shut it. Thank you. So let's go over how motion is perceived by the retina, because science can measure such things and allow us to compare this ability across a number of animal species, including our dogs. And you may find this fascinating because how animals perceive motion may have a lot to do with how they perceive the passage of time. In other words, time itself didn't change, but the perception of it did. But first, a few basics about the retina. Many people already have a general idea about the different kinds of photoreceptors that our retinas contain. For example, cones and rods. Most people have actually heard of those things. But photoreceptors detect the different wavelengths of energy contained in light. So let's go over the cones and the rods and see how they're different. For cones, they're for color vision in daylight. And they detect a lot of detail because of all the colors involved. Therefore, cones can help produce a higher visual acuity, which means a clearer image of what you're seeing. They're not so good, however, at detecting motion. But humans have three kinds of cones that detect the wavelengths of red, blue, and green light. and we see the entire spectrum of visible light. Dogs don't. And dogs have two types of cones. They have blue cones, and then they have cones that combine the detection of red and green wavelengths. So their color spectrum is restricted, and they end up having less detail about color as it comes in compared to us. Therefore, their visual acuity is not as good as ours. But it's not bad. And they also have fewer cones. However, it's a very different story when it comes to the rods. And the rods are for vision in low light, and they don't detect colors. However, they're great at distinguishing among gray tones from white to black. And they're also great at detecting movement, especially when using peripheral vision. And dogs have way more rods than we do, but fewer cones. And that makes their ratio of rods to cones much higher than ours. They also have something called a tapetum lucidum. And that's a layer of tissue behind the retina that humans don't have that acts like a mirror. And it reflects light back through the retina a second time to process some of the light that was missed initially as it passed through the retina. And this is exactly what makes animals' eyes glow in the dark, or when you take a picture of them in low light. In fact, this is a picture of a wolf with the so-called glowing eyes, but it's just light being reflected back off of the tapetum lucidum. In fact, when us residents are driving around here at night, we use this phenomenon to help find deer in the dark to help avoid colliding with them, although that doesn't always work. Okay, so those are some of the basics of sight when it comes to wolves and dogs. And in summary, the science shows that dogs are more focused on the action of an object rather than what the object is. In other words, canids are more concerned about what the object is doing. Plus, dog retinas have sacrificed a bit of visual acuity and some color vision to have room for additional rods which sense motion and are sensitive to black and white imaging. And it's along with the gray tones in between the white and the black. And these additional characteristics are necessary for perceiving visual information in low light. In other words, canids see very well in the dark, and we don't, relatively speaking. And given the differences in their retinas versus ours, this helps to produce a very different umwelt compared to us. And this is just the sense of vision. What about all the other senses that are happening at the same time? The result is that canids, meaning dogs, wolves, coyotes, foxes, and so on, experience the world in radically different ways than we do. So let's stick with the perception of motion for a few minutes to get across how mind-blowingly different it can really be. Remember Shoni racing around like a lunatic? Well, at that speed, she can see much more detail than we can, which allows predators like wolves to make much more accurate adjustments in real time when chasing their prey. How do we know this? Well, it's by using a concept in which we can compare the ability of a variety of species in regards to how they perceive motion. So here is some scientific lingo that you may not have heard of. And again, sometimes scientific phrases might intimidate people, but this concept means exactly what it says. It's called the flicker fusion rate. And again, it means exactly what it says, and I will explain that to you. Scientists have been able to measure the ability of how animals perceive motion and in a number of species, including us. And they do this by monitoring how the retina of these animals responds to a flashing light. And each flash is called a flicker, and the measurements are taken in flickers per second. And I'll use this flashlight as an example. For example, you could show this to an animal, and it's flickering like one flicker per second. And then you increase that speed until you end up getting more flickers per second until all of a sudden you can't, and I apologize if I'm inducing seizures in half the people watching this, but you keep increasing the speed of the flickers until you just get a solid, steady light. And when that happens, it's called flicker fusion. And flicker fusion then is the point where your perception of the flickering stops. Of course it hasn't, but you perceive it that way because that's the upper limit of your perception of motion. And the point here is when this happens, it's called the flicker fusion rate. And the rate is the number of flickers per second where flickering is no longer detected. And instead, once again, you get the light that's just on and perceived as steady. When all animals are tested in this way, and this is important, a specific rate is found for each of the species that were tested, which makes all of these animals comparable. And the different rates found for different species can then be used to determine how they exactly perceive their surroundings, which will be different than us, of course. For example, a starfish perceives motion, however, it does so at only 4 flickers per second. And a housefly can perceive motion up to 250 flickers per second, which makes it very difficult to use a fly swatter successfully. Why? Well, we're actually going to get into that because that's the question I'll be answering near the end of the video. But right now, what does the flicker fusion rate actually mean? I'll demonstrate as we compare humans with wolves. We're going to do 2 things here. First, we'll go over the concept of flicker rates and how an increased number of flickers per second provides more information of an object that is moving. Second, we'll see what that information provides and how wolves and dogs compare with humans. You'll see afterwards that although we share the same world with these animals, even their perception of movement contributes to a different understanding of the same world we're experiencing. For example, overall, when an object is moving, your retina and ultimately your brain are processing the small bits of information coming in. And in this case, each bit of info is a flicker. Your brain then blends the flickers together as if what you're seeing is moving in a consistent way. So if you're seeing fewer flickers per second than your dog, for example, that means less information is coming in about the object that's moving. Therefore, you'll see its movement as more of a blur. The dog or wolf will see the image in more detail while experiencing the same movement. That's because their retinas can process more flickers per second than we can. So more details or information are obtained in the same amount of time. You know now that that's because of the rods, and the wolves have way more of them than we do. Plus at night in low light, they're recycling the light, so to speak, passing through the retina and reflecting it back through to gather even more information. Something we can't do because us primates, and it turns out pigs as well, don't have a tapetum lucidum, but the other mammals do. So now let's use some video to get an idea of the kind of detail the canids can see that we can't. For example, like when they watch a deer running and make adjustments to its body orientation just before it makes a turn. If you can see that, then you can anticipate where the deer is likely to go next, and then simultaneously make adjustments to your own movements before the deer turns. It turns out humans have a flicker frequency rate of 60 flickers per second, and wolves have a rate of 80 flickers per second. Therefore, wolves have 25% more flickers per second than a human, and the seconds start adding up. Therefore, they see faster, so to speak, than we do, and the processing of more information per second than us. This means the details of the movement will be more apparent to the wolf or your dog. And in this example, I had to slow down the video to approximate the extra 25% of information per second wolves receive versus us. Therefore, the video is slower for the wolf. I'm not saying wolves perceive the world slower than we do, but instead, that extra time the video took for the wolf example is the amount of extra information that they would receive that we don't. That's the only purpose of slowing down the video, because our eyes don't actually work like cameras. Nevertheless, slowing down the video can show the quality of information the wolf sees rather than the speed at which it sees it. And I'll play it back several times, but first watch the human side. I'll play that again. Now watch the wolf side. Play it again. And you'll see that the leg the deer is using to scratch itself is moving slower on the wolf side. especially at the hoof, which provides additional detail about the movement. The wolf isn't seeing it slower, it just gets this kind of detail in real time. It's processing the information about movement faster than us, and so are your dogs. One more time. But let's take a longer look and watch this mother and her fawn. And I'll play it several times again and watch the human side first, then watch the wolf side. I'll play it one more time. The extra time the video proceeds after the human side has stopped represents the amount of information about the movement that we're missing, and clearly shows the additional detail of movement the wolf can perceive. This would be important information when running at full speed trying to catch the deer. In the same number of seconds that you saw a moving object kind of as a blur, they saw it in more detail by processing more information per second. So again, they see faster, meaning the processing of movement can be handled at a greater rate by their retinas and their brain than ours can. The result is seeing much more detail as something is moving, which helps explain why dogs appear to be more attentive, initially anyway, to the movement of an object rather than what the object is. They're designed for that, as you saw in the retina, which has more rods. They see better in lower light, reprocess light because of their tapetum lucidum, and so on. Therefore, they come to a different conclusion than we do about exactly the same incident because they have more information about it, and they're able to process it in a much faster way, and all in exactly the same amount of time that you saw it. Also, when a deer or a fawn, for example, is standing completely still to avoid detection, any tiny movement can result in possible death. For example, with a higher flicker fusion rate, animals like wolves could see a slight flick of the ear, something that we would see either incompletely or miss completely. And this would be one of those times when you might say, wait, I think I saw something, especially if it was out of the corner of your eye. So you would orient your head in the direction of the movement and then see nothing. But it's possible you did perceive the movement in some kind of way, but it was at the upper end of your ability to perceive it. However, at 80 flickers per second, the wolf would have a greater chance of seeing that movement and locating its prey, because more information per second about that movement was perceived. However, that's just the first step. Now you have to catch your prey, which is a completely different skill set. Even with such abilities, for example, wolves only catch about 20% of the prey they're chasing. Is that because they suck at what they do? No, the prey are good at what they do as well. So the interactions of life forms can be highly, highly competitive. Those who are still alive are the best of the best, and any advantage that can be had is constantly being sought out. This is similar to sports, say like the NFL. There's a range of abilities throughout the league, and clearly the superstars stand out. But the reality is that even the worst players in the league are still better than the rest of humanity at playing football. There isn't a huge difference between them and the very best in their sport, but that difference is enough to consistently overcome the rest of the competition. So, highly competitive. And wolves live in such a competition. Any advantage could mean the difference between eating or starving. They are already superstars at staying alive, yet it's all they can do just to get the 20% of what they pursue. Life lives on a knife's edge. The flicker rate for ungulates, meaning hoofstock, like deer and elk, so the wolves' prey, hasn't been studied extensively, so we don't know that much about their flicker fusion rates. But we do know that for sheep, it's less than 80 flickers per second, so less than wolves. And although deer can run faster than wolves, the wolves can see their movement more precisely than the deer can see the wolves' movements, and therefore make corrections when chasing them down, in regards to the wolves. So it's a life and death scenario in which both parties are using their advantages and having their disadvantages exploited. Nevertheless, the result is that wolves catch only 20% of what they chase. Plus, the time of day, the amount of light, and so on can either optimize the potential flicker rate or decrease it. In deer, they see best in the morning and evening when they're the most active. Whether or not wolves accommodate for this is not really their choice. That's when the deer are the most active and they need to take advantage of it. It's all part of the, quote, game of staying alive. Oh, speaking of which, I hear the elk. So it must be time to answer some questions. While I was making this video, someone asked me about the flicker fusion rate of household flies, and if that contributed to the difficulty of killing them with the fly swatter. And in fact, I've known several people who are quite proud about their skills using a fly swatter. But at least that's how they thought of it. But for the rest of us, a fly's flicker fusion rate can cause havoc when trying to use the fly swatter successfully. And that's because their flicker fusion rate is about 250 flickers per second, so 4 times faster than our 60 flickers per second. And flies may not be the intellectual giants of the animal kingdom, but they do make good decisions in response to motions coming their way. When using a swatter, most people swat as fast as they can, and the movement is perceived to be high speed from our perspective. They take aim, then whack, but they miss, and that's because the fly's perspective is very, very different. There's so much information coming in per second that the fly has already seen the details of the motion well before the swatter arrives and can easily fly somewhere else before it hits. In other words, we see the blur of the swatter moving through the air. In that same amount of time, the fly's much greater processing speed for motion has already calculated the trajectory of that swatter, figured out a response, and for all we know, they had an espresso, walked the dog, and took a nap before they finally moved out of the way. So another way to look at this is how a fly might perceive time, at least in terms of motion. So much information is coming in at once that their perception may be that the swatter is moving in slow motion compared to what we would see. For the person using the swatter, the entire event is, swat. For the fly, it's more like swat. And not because time became slower, but because of the clarity of information that's coming in. And then they move out of the way. They see more quickly what is really happening than we can. They make corrections before the swatter gets there. Keep in mind, motion is only one component of their umwelt, and they're integrating other factors as well at the same time. For example, perhaps they can react to the pressure wave produced by the swatter material coming towards them, which is compressing the air as it moves. Just know that umwelts are the result of all factors happening at the same time, and we're only looking at one thing here, and that's motion, just to get a grasp on how this process works. Having said that, flies do get caught out on occasion, in which case it's like, no, help me. All this can also help explain why a dog that's never been abused sometimes backs up if you reach out too quickly to pet it. It's a bit like the swatter coming at the fly. There's a greater amount of information about the movement of our hand than you can perceive. The dog is already seeing the details of the movement, which show the hand coming towards them, the direction it's taking towards their face, and it's not stopping. So like the fly, the dog steps out of the way before your hand actually gets there. So the detail is enough so the dog doesn't have to wait until your hand arrives. So next time, we'll finish going over the umwelt of wolves by looking at their other senses, and then eventually use this information to see how wolves live and interact with the surrounding environment. And wolves, like other predators, have a specific role in the successful functioning of ecosystems, which is disrupted when we kill them, like via hunting and control actions. And we'll take a look at that process as well in the future. Until then, however, see you next time.